Friends, it is good to have you here today. If you don't know, my name is Brandon. I get the privilege of being one of the pastors here on staff, and we're so grateful that you chose to join us today. If you're joining us online, thank you for joining us online. We're in a series called The Struggle is Real. How many of you could say, hey, the struggle is real right now? There's plenty of us that could say that. Well, what we're doing is we are walking systematically through the book of 1 Corinthians. What is the book of 1 Corinthians? Well, it is a book found in the New Testament. It was written by a guy named Paul that had missionary journeys throughout the Roman Empire. And one of the churches that he started was in Corinth, the Corinthians. He started this church. He spent 18 months there. He told them about Jesus. He discipled them. He was like a father figure to these people, a mentor to these people. He saw them have amazing breakthroughs, just like any church. I mean, he saw them have radical breakthroughs in their marriages and in their parenting. These people hold a dear place in his heart. Well, after 18 months, he continued on his missionary journey, starting churches throughout the Roman Empire. And about 5 years after those 18 months, he gets a report. And the report is not so good. He gets a report that the people in Corinth are struggling. The church in Corinth, they're struggling people, and they've got all kinds of issues. And so this letter is written as a response to the issues that he has heard about. So he's writing to a church he dearly loves that has major issues. Now, here's what would be really easy for all of us as we journey through this book: to look at this church with a judgmental eye, to go, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that they are struggling with this. I'm horrified at what they are going through right now and the issues they are dealing with. And here's what we have said from the beginning of this series. Don't have a judgmental eye, but have this kind of heart. To know that every church is a struggling church. There's no perfect church. And every Christian is a struggling Christian. So if you identify as a follower of Jesus, you're in the middle of a process that the Bible calls sanctification, meaning you and I haven't arrived. We haven't made it to a place where we have dealt with and addressed all the issues that we have deep inside of us, that we still have ongoing issues that we battle and struggle with every single day. So instead, our heart should not be one of judgment towards this church, but one that simply declares, Lord, teach us. Use this book that was written 2,000 years ago to teach us today how we are to live in light of the gospel. And so that's the kind of the heartbeat. Now, issue number one that we saw last week, what are they struggling with? Well, they're struggling with division. Remember, they are in a place where there is not a church on every other corner. They can't simply go, I don't like these people anymore. I don't like the style of worship anymore. I don't like this preaching anymore. I'm going to go down the road to this church. No, in the city of Corinth, there is one gathered body. So when they would gather together, but they would do so, and there would be major factions and divisions within the church. Some people were like, I follow Paul, the guy that started the church, the mentor, the father-like figure. Some people were like, I follow Apollos, the new guy on the block who's really gifted at speaking and leading. Or I follow Cephas, the leader of the Jewish Christians. Or I follow Christ, which was really a Jesus juke. So all these people are gathering together, and they're divided, and there's factions that are happening within the church. And so Paul is going to address the divisions that are happening in the church in Corinth. And today, how he's going to do it is he's going to serve a healthy slice of humble pie. How many of you have ever been served that kind of pie before? You know, you think you have it figured out. So you think you have parenting figured out, right? Before you have kids, you're like, I would never let my kids do that. And then you have kids, and then the Lord gives you a large slice of humble pie, going, oh my gosh, all those years of judgment, and here I am. You think you finally figured out marriage and relationships, and then you have Valentine's Day roll around, right? And then you realize maybe you don't have it all figured out. My wife got a really great gift. I knocked it out of the park. I don't always do it, but this year I did. It was a pillow that just said, I want to touch your butt all the time. And so that's what she wanted to hear, and so I gave it to her. But what we find is in marriage, we don't have it figured out, and the Lord will often serve us humble pie. So when you think about your life and you think that you have it all figured out, just know that we're in the middle of a process and that at times the Lord will put up a mirror and say, this is how broken it is. And because I love you, I refuse to leave you in that brokenness. I want to grow you. I want to transform you. I want you to be a better dad out of this, a better husband, and ultimately to glorify me with all parts of your life. So that's often what the Lord does. So as we journey through this, again, don't have a judgmental eye towards the church in Corinth. Instead, what I want you to do is say, Lord, would you please teach us? So we'll start in chapter 1, verse 17. And this is what Paul writes to the church in Corinth. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel. And not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. Now, we touched on this last week, that these factions were often dividing over personality or preferences, styles. They like this leader over this leader. There was a lot of pride going on. They think they figured it out. And so Paul goes, I'm really glad I didn't baptize a lot of you because part of their division was this. I was baptized by this guy. And so that's who I am, owing my allegiance to. I followed this guy, not this guy. And Paul's like, well, I'm actually glad I shared the gospel with you and I didn't actually do the baptism myself. Because it's not about who performs the baptism, but the declaration of the baptism. That I am Christ. He is mine and I am his. That's the declaration. But again, they were dividing, going, I'm so glad I was baptized by him. He goes, I'm glad I came to you and I preached the word. But he says something really interesting. He goes, I came to you and I didn't do it with eloquent wisdom. Here's what he's essentially saying. I was a foolish preacher preaching foolishly to you. Now, in this day, if you know anything about public speaking or orators of that day, this was a high value in Greek and Roman culture. Some of the most famous people of that day were public speakers. They were orators. So they would travel around the Roman Empire and people would pay money to come see them. They would gather large crowds. They wanted to hear this guy speak. And often what was valued was not the content, but the kind of delivery. One commentator said it this way. It was almost like they had magic. Like the tactics that they used to engage the audience, the manner and the tactics and the strategy they used to draw people in to listen to them, it was like so engaging that they were almost in like a trance. They were just brought in to this person's speech. And he goes, I was really different than most of the public speakers, the famous people, the orators of that day. When I came to you, it wasn't with eloquent wisdom. So in other words, I didn't have great delivery. We know from different clues in the Bible that Paul likely wasn't a very good public speaker. Now, he was a very intelligent man. He loved the Lord. He saw great fruit in his preaching, but he probably wasn't the best speaker. And he goes, I didn't have eloquent wisdom. But they had a high value on the delivery, not the content. And he goes, something's fundamentally changed when it comes to the preaching of the gospel. Here's the fundamental difference. It's about the content, not the delivery. So it's about what is being preached, not how it's being preached. And we would do well to take note of that today. Because we have lots and lots of really gifted speakers in our world. Some bear the title even pastor. And what they do is they engage and they woo. It's almost like kind of this magic that brings people in and they're engaged and they're tracking with the speaker. But when you dig into the content of the message, you realize that it lacks substance. And Paul goes, our power is not in the delivery of the Christian message, but the content, the power of Christ and Christ crucified. That's what saves. A few years back, we had a guest speaker, and it was at a different church. It wasn't at this one. We had a guest speaker, and he spoke that day, and it was one of those awkward sermons that you're like squirming in your seat. You're like, this is terrible. I cannot wait for this to be over. I feel awkward for you being on stage. I know some of you are like, I feel that right now. But you just feel awkward, and it's weird, and you're like, can this please end? It's like the minutes are going by slow. And he got done, and I'm like, clearly nobody got anything out of that, right? And what was really fascinating is that day, there was a gal sitting in the audience, and she goes, today I feel impressed by the Lord to be an overseas missionary. And it's been a wonderful thing to watch that girl travel into parts of Asia that she could not publicly share because being a Christian there, spreading the gospel is not legal. She spent time in Ethiopia. Now she's training college students and reaching the nations through these college students. And I'm like, that was foolish preaching. The delivery was terrible and awkward, but there was content there. There was substance there. And the Lord used that to show his power and his glory, that he woos and draws people, again, not on delivery. Because we get large crowds that remain in their same state. They're not transformed by delivery. But true transformation is the content of what we share, the power of the gospel. That's what changes. So don't be wooed by the latest speaker or pastor or even us. No, instead, focus on what is being preached. And focus on the gospel that is being preached. And if it is not being preached, there will be no transformation and there will be no true power in spite of the crowds getting larger. So he goes, listen, when I came to you, I was a foolish preacher. I was foolishly preaching. Not with eloquent words, but with the power of the gospel, a fundamental shift. And now what he's going to do is he's going to talk about the content of this message. So what is this message that he is talking about? Well, he'll get a little bit more in depth in verse 18 through 25. He says, for the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, and this is written in Isaiah, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where's the one who is wise? Where's the scribe? Where's the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and a folly to the Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. So he goes, I was a foolish preacher. But I want to tell you about the message that I preach. I was preaching a foolish message. There are two responses that he says. Whenever he would go and he would preach the gospel to new people groups, he's like, there's kind of two responses. The first is those who are called by God. They're given eyes to see and ears to hear. They respond to God and is the power to save them and transform them. So literally, transformation begins to happen when they hear the gospel. They're wooed not by the delivery, but by the message. And they're drawn to God, and they were saved, and they're transformed and being transformed. And then there's another group of people, and these people said that is complete lunacy and foolishness. Now, there's different reasons why people fall in this camp. There's different reasons why people reject the gospel. Some people have intellectual reasons, right? They're like, okay, this just does not make sense. I'm an intellectual person, and when I draw out my own reasoning and my own logic, I don't believe in the gospel or the Bible. Some people have some emotional issues. They're like, I've been deeply hurt by those who call themselves Christians or pastors. And so I cannot accept this message because I have some emotional wounds. Some people have relational issues. They're like, yeah, I know some hypocrites, so I can't believe this message. They claim to follow Jesus, and then I look at their life and I'm like, there's not alignment between what they preach and what they share and how they live. And so people will reject the gospel for many, many reasons. And he goes, I'll tell you about two groups. Well, the first group is the Jews. The Jews reject the gospel. It's a stumbling block to them because they demand signs. So this is their issue. They want signs. Now, throughout Jesus' ministry, you see this playing itself out. I want to read to you a couple stories. Matthew chapter 12, verse 38. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, Jesus, saying, Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you. But he answered them, an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign. But no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Jesus did not give them a sign. They demanded a sign. They go, we'll believe you. We'll trust you. We'll follow you. We just need a sign. And he goes, it's not going to be given to you, you evil and adulterous generation. A few chapters later, Matthew 16, same thing happens again. And the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and to test him, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. Again, they want a sign. They'll believe. Just give us a sign. We'll believe. Go to verse 4 of that. He says it again. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. So he left them and departed. Years ago, there was a debate I was watching, and it was some prominent atheists and some prominent pastors, and they're kind of going back and forth. And one of the pastors asked a really engaging question along these lines. He goes, what would it take for you to believe? Like, how could you come to faith in Jesus? And the atheist over here, one of the atheists, he goes, all right, a certifiable and verifiable miracle. If I witness that, then I will believe in Jesus. I will trust in Jesus. Again, it's the same line of thinking that the Jews had. But what's really fascinating is every time a sign was demanded of Jesus, he never gave one. He only pointed to the resurrection. This is the illusion of Jonah. I'm going to die 3 days, be buried, and then I'm going to rise and conquer the grave, sin, and death. So let me answer this question. Why did he not give them a sign? Why does he not give this atheist a sign right now? Like, ride it in the clouds. Do something supernatural. I want to give you 3 reasons why we see signs not occurring when they're demanded. The first is the signs he did perform were rejected or discarded. So what's really fascinating is they demanded signs, but they saw him heal. They saw him heal the lame, heal the leper, give sight to the blind. They watched him do miraculous things like feed thousands of people with just a little food. He didn't do this under the cover of night, right? He did this publicly. And here's what they would often do. They would explain it away. Well, the reason why he was able to do this was he was controlled by demonic forces. Clearly, like Satan is doing something here. He's doing it on the wrong day, at the wrong time, in the wrong place. People are beginning to follow him. We don't think he's trustworthy. They would explain away and try to reason away all the miracles he did perform. So we have the same issue often. We'll see God move in our life, and because we're Westerners, and our mind wants to be logical and scientific, we write off the great supernatural things that God does do in our life. Another reason why Jesus never did a sign when demanded is the signs he performed were not the signs that they actually wanted. What did the Jews actually want of the Messiah? Like, what sign are they really after? If they rejected all these other signs, they explained them away, what sign did they want? Well, here's what they wanted. The sign for them would be, Jesus, lead our military, take over the Roman Empire, reestablish the nation of Israel, sit on the throne. We want political freedom from them. This is the sign that we want. So Jesus knew even if he performed a supernatural sign, it wasn't the sign that they wanted. He came to save them from the inside out, to give them a brand new heart, but what they really wanted was a military and political leader. So he knew that even if I performed a sign, you may explain it away or reason away, but this is not really what you want. You want a sign to your own liking. I think the last reason why is we see the greatest sign, of course, is the resurrection. He kept pointing to the resurrection each time. The resurrection. Think about Jonah, 3 days. That's how it's going to be. I'm going to die, and then I'm going to be buried, and then I'm going to come back alive. This is the greatest sign, right? Think about the greatest enemy you and I face. I mean, truly, like, dumb it down. What's the greatest enemy we face? The great enemy, death, right? That everybody before us has succumbed to. But if there's one that can conquer this great enemy, if there's one that can overcome the grave, rob death, defeat death, then I'd be willing to give my eternity, my eternal trust and hope to him. So he kept pointing, here's the greatest sign of all, that I am going to come back resurrected, fully and completely. So the Jews, they rejected the gospel. It was a stumbling block to them. They demanded a sign. He goes, listen, I know you're going to explain it away. I know it's not going to be the sign that you want, but I'm going to keep pointing you to the resurrection. The greatest sign ever occurred. And here we sit, and we have historic evidence that the resurrection is true and verifiable, but we're still asking for God to do a sign. He's like, that's the greatest sign ever done. I'm alive. I conquered the grave, and the tomb no longer holds me. So some people reject the gospel right off as foolishness because they demand a sign. He goes, well, the Greeks, they seek wisdom. Again, the Greeks had a high value on philosophy, on logic, on rationale. And they go, all right, what you're telling us is that God Almighty stepped down from the throne room of heaven, and that he was flesh and blood, fully man. He was born of a virgin, an unwed, teen, poor virgin. And he was born in a stable. There was no fanfare. There was no grand entrance. And then he lived 30 years in obscurity. So he's supposed to be God in the flesh. And he lives 30 years just being a simple carpenter. And then he has 3 years of public ministry, which we hear some of the things that he's done. But then he died the most vile of deaths. Like a crucified king defies all logic. And much like the Jews, a political leader, a military leader, that's more in alignment with what we think of when we think about a Messiah coming to save us. But you're saying he died a vile death that only the worst criminals went through? And then you say 3 days later he rose from the grave. We've never seen anybody rise from the grave. And so for them, they look at this and they're like, every point and every turn of the story you just told us, it defies our logic and rationale. It's not in alignment with our philosophy. And so we reject that in the same way that, again, our Western minds go to, if it's not scientific, whatever that means, if it's not backed by science, if it doesn't fit within the natural order, then we can no longer believe it. And of course, to believe the gospel is to truly believe in the supernatural. Again, God comes and puts on flesh and blood, dies on the cross in our place for our sins, and 3 days later rises from the dead. and now sits at the right hand of the Father and is coming again. That's pretty supernatural. That's not natural. And so they rejected. Listen, they were too smart for the gospel. Now, here's what's really fascinating to me. If you and I were to draw up the story of the Messiah, what would it look like for us to really be saved? Well, we would have chosen the brightest, the best, the most noble. There'll be lots of fanfare when he comes. And then he'll have a great following when he's alive. And then his resurrection, he would sit on a physical throne. And he would just be there for all to see. Strong, powerful, not a crucified Messiah. Not calling us to deny self. And yet that's what we have. And here's what I find actually beautiful about the gospel. Is you and I would not have drawn it up that way. How God has unfolded his redemptive plans are not the way any human being would have ever drawn it up. And that's fascinating to me. Why? Because if there is an incomprehensible God who created a universe that's beyond all logic, reason, and comprehension, then I would expect his redemptive plans to be incomprehensible. We could not derive or conceive of them ourselves. C.S. Lewis, he said it this way: reality, in fact, is usually something you could not have guessed. That is one of the reasons I believe Christianity. If it offered us just the kind of universe we had always expected, I should feel we were making it up. If God is so big, so sovereign, all-knowing, then you and I wouldn't be able to draw up his plans of redemption on our own. Isaiah records the words of God, and he says this in Isaiah 55, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts your thoughts." So Paul used a little play on words at the very end in verse 25. He's like, the foolishness of God, which God, there's no foolishness there. The foolishness of God is wiser than any wisdom that can come from man. It says the weakness of God, and there is no weakness, but he's playing with words here. The weakness of God is stronger than anything man could come up with. In other words, at our best day, at our most logical, rational day, we would have never drawn it up this way. At our strongest points, we would have never drawn up the gospel this way and how God saves. So please listen to me. Paul comes in and he goes, I was a foolish preacher preaching a foolish message. And then he's going to ask them to do a little survey of their own congregation. You ready for this? Verse 26. This is the survey that they'll take. "For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. And because of him, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption. So that, as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord." He goes, all right, I was a foolish preacher preaching a foolish message. Are you ready for this? To a foolish people. I mean, this is humble pie served up and delivered. You guys think that you're better, that you're stronger. You create these divisions in your pride and arrogance. Let me remind you of who I am, what the gospel is, and who you are. He goes, hey, not many of you were of noble birth. In Roman culture, there was a pretty clear caste system that even if you were a slave and somehow you earned your freedom, you would still be a freedman, but you'd still have a lowly social status that would never be able to be elevated. If you were born of noble birth, if you just had nobility in your bloodline, well, then you're always going to have this social status. There wasn't a whole lot of movement in social status back then. He goes, so many of you, you look around, you didn't come from the right bloodline. You were weak. You were foolish. Now, we do have some evidence that there were some people of prominence in this church that did have wealth, but he goes, not many of you. So listen to this. God chose to build his church with the foolish, with the lowly, with the discarded, and here's what I love. Build his church through the foolish preaching of a foolish message to a foolish people. How can we have any pride when we look at like how God has designed salvation? How he saved us? How we came to him? Who we are? He goes, no one's going to stand in the presence of God and point to their own accolades, their own accomplishments, their self, and go, well, clearly, God, clearly you showed yourself to me because I was smart enough. I was wise enough. I was from the right bloodline. Clearly, Lord, you chose me to be a part of your kingdom and your family because of who I am. He goes, no. When you think about how the Lord saves, who he saves, how it all unravels, we'll have one boast before the Lord. And that boast will be King Jesus. We can't even say, I chose him. All we could say is, he chose us. He did it all. I had nothing to do with any of this. So there'll be no boasting before the Lord except the King Jesus has saved us. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to respond in a few different ways. If you're here and maybe you've struggled with the gospel message, it never made logical sense to you or rational sense. Can I say this? The way God's designed it and who he is, from a human perspective, it never will. This is the faith part. That we trust him because we see something that's beyond our comprehension. How he designed it, how he saved us, it's beyond us. I would encourage you today, if the Lord is drawing you to himself, to submit to that and go, I'm ready. I'm ready to trust him. I'm ready to take this leap of faith. Maybe the Lord's stirring something in you. You're like, I need to take the next step. I want to be baptized. I want to declare that I'm his and he is mine. Whatever the Lord is stirring in you, I would encourage you to take that step. Let us know. We want to walk with you. You can see how to do it on the screen here.